Getting diagnosed as an autistic at 40-something explained a lot. Not because I suddenly understood myself, but because I suddenly understood why everyone else looked so exhausted. You ever notice political arguments start exactly the same way? We need a law, and they just accept that sentence? My brain doesn't do that. My brain goes, okay, then what? And my problem is that nobody ever finishes the sentence. They stop right before the interesting part. And I didn't realize that this was unusual until I got diagnosed autistic later in life. See, I didn't know I was autistic. I just thought everyone else had incredibly low standards for finishing a thought. Seriously. Turns out most people hear we should pass a law and just nod like that's a complete sentence. I hear it like someone handed me half of a math problem. We need a law. Okay, then what? Well, people would have to obey it. And if they don't, there'll be a fine. Then what? Court. Then what? Asset seizure. Then what? Darren, why are you making this weird? I'm not making it weird. I'm just trying to finish the idea. There's a difference. And apparently that's my superpower, following political ideas all the way to their logical end, instead of stopping where the campaign commercial ends. Most political conversations stop at the slogan. I keep reading the instruction manual. Have you noticed that political commercials never explain how anything works? They all follow exactly the same formula. I'm going to lower costs. Fantastic. How? I'm going to protect children. Excellent. How? I'm going to defend freedom. Wonderful. How? Silence. And then a bald eagle flies across the screen. Credits roll. I love America, but bald eagles have solved exactly zero public policy problems. They've got one skill, looking majestic, like it knows something that we don't. If majestic solved inflation, I'd elect Sam Elliott's mustache. And notice the verbs. Politicians love verbs. Protect, ban, require, fund, expand, reduce, reform, restore, secure. You know what verb they never use? Force. Because that sounds less inspirational. Imagine campaign ads if they were honest. I'm Susan McGovernment. I believe that peaceful Americans should be compelled to comply with my preferred public policy priorities. Not quite as catchy. So instead, we get euphemisms. We'll ensure compliance. We'll establish guidelines. We'll enhance accountability. Sorry, but that's still just force, wearing business casual. Politicians have invented an entire thesaurus to avoid saying, we're going to make you. Because if you follow any of those sentences far enough, you'll always end up in the same place. Not ideology, not debate, just enforcement. And every time somebody says we should require, I hear, or Steve shows up. You don't know Steve yet, but Steve is coming. Steve always comes. So let's say Congress decides that America has a vegetable problem. And honestly, looking around Texas, they may have a point. We pass the National Broccoli Responsibility Act. Every American must eat broccoli every Tuesday. Now, before the comments section explodes, no, I don't think Congress is banning Tuesdays. Stay with me. What happens if I don't eat broccoli? Nothing. Okay, then why did we pass the law? Okay, maybe there's a $20 fine. I don't pay it, and then what? Late fees, I don't pay, and then what? Court, I don't go, then what? Judgment, still no, then what? Asset seizure, still no, then what? Arrest, still no, then what? Steve. Steve is wearing body armor because apparently broccoli is now a tactical situation. Steve didn't wake up thinking, you know what this country needs? More cruciferous vegetables. Steve is just doing his job. Because politics doesn't reward restraint. It rewards action, even if that action is just doing something, anything. It's like politicians think government is that one friend who owns a pickup truck. Need to move? Government. Need a couch? Government. Need somebody to watch your dog? Government. Need emotional closure after your fantasy football season? Government. At some point, your friend just stops answering your texts. But we've reached a point where government has exactly one remaining argument, because we said so. And here's the weird part. Nobody objects until Steve arrives. Everybody loves the law. Nobody loves the last page of the instruction manual. Here's where the Republicans and Democrats are going to be equally annoyed with me, which is perfect, because if both sides are irritated, I'm probably finally talking about the real problem. Republicans and Democrats have way more in common than they would ever admit. Republicans say we should ban. Democrats say we should require. Republicans say we should prohibit. Democrats say we should mandate. Republicans say we should stop people from. Democrats say we should make people. Different verbs, same sentence structure. And I think I figured out why politicians all sound the same. Because they all shop at the same store. Welcome to Government Depot, where every aisle contains exactly one product: force. They're basically IKEA. Different showroom, same Allen wrench. Need to solve homelessness? Government Depot. Need healthcare? Government Depot. Need education? Government Depot. Need housing? Government Depot. Need obesity? Government Depot. Need loneliness? Government Depot. Need people to stop putting pineapple on pizza? Government Depot. Although for that one, I'm willing to hear the arguments. Now, government doesn't solve every problem. Government has exactly one superpower: Steve. Steve doesn't build houses. Steve doesn't invent smartphones. Steve has one job. He shows up after everybody else has failed. The problem isn't that government sometimes uses force. The problem is that in politics, doing nothing is almost never considered a serious option. Every candidate has to promise they'll do something, and in government, doing something often means giving Steve another file. That's not criticism, it's literally the job description. Government is the only institution allowed to compel compliance. And that's an enormous power. So maybe we should ask ourselves whether every problem really deserves it. You know who perfectly understands government? Homeowners associations. HOAs are basically tiny governments run by people who looked at middle school hall monitors and thought this, but with more authority. HOAs are fascinating because everyone hates them until it's their turn in the seat. Then suddenly it's, no, see, my rule is important. Politics works exactly the same way. Nobody likes government power. They just like their turn with government power. That's different. You ever get one of those HOA letters? We've noticed that your trash can was visible for approximately 14 seconds after pickup. Really? Because I noticed Karen has 17 ceramic flamingos conducting what appears to be a military coup against Mrs. Garcia's prized hydrangeas. But apparently that's still within architectural guidelines. So let's test this by playing a game. I'm going to read a campaign promise, and you tell me which party said it. Ready? We're going to protect our communities. Could be either. We're going to keep children safe. Either. We're going to preserve freedom. Still, either. We're going to hold people accountable. Either. Because the first few words always imply the same thing. Government should. That's the sentence that nobody questions. Government should, government should, government should. It's the political equivalent of owning exactly one tool, a hammer. Every problem starts looking like a nail. Actually, it's worse than a hammer. It's owning one hammer and one Steve. Because somewhere, off camera, Steve is putting on his duty belt. Now here's one of my favorite thought experiments. Imagine tomorrow morning, every elected official you voted for is replaced by people you complain about on Facebook. Every single one. How many powers would you still want government to have? See, that's a better question than do I trust today's politicians? Because today's politicians are temporary. Powers are not. And systems don't care who you voted for. So now here's the key distinction that most debates miss. Government absolutely has a role. The question is not should force exist. The question is when does it become justified to initiate it against someone who hasn't harmed anyone? That's the line nobody likes drawing, but it's the only line that matters. As a Marine, we're taught something very important. Never design a system that only works when perfect people are in charge, because perfect people don't exist. Also, never volunteer for anything. That one's unrelated, but it's still good advice. Because every policy proposal comes with the same government starter pack. First, clipboard. Can't have government without paperwork. Then, a regulation. Then, a fine. Then, a court date. Then, Steve. Every single time. Different policy, same starter pack. And nobody notices this pattern because it feels normal until you ask one question. Then what? Remember back at the beginning when I kept asking, then what? That wasn't me being difficult. Okay, it was mostly me being difficult, but there was a reason. Every political argument eventually reaches a moment where someone says, because the government, and then everybody stops thinking. That's the moment I want to zoom in on, because hidden inside almost every political argument is the same assumption. If this idea is good enough, government should make people do it. That's it. That's the whole thing. I call it the force doctrine. No, not that force. Although if you've ever stood in line in DMV, you may have wondered whether or not the Empire won. I call it that because it's not an official philosophy. You'll never find it in a political science textbook. It's just my shorthand for a habit of thinking, one that Democrats do, one that Republicans do, Libertarians sometimes do. I probably do it if I don't pay attention. It's the reflex to reach for government force before we've exhausted persuasion, initiatives, markets, civil society, families, charities, innovation, or simple neighborliness. And here's where it gets important, because people hear force and think I'm talking about something extreme. But force doesn't show up at the beginning. It shows up at the end of a decision tree that nobody reads. And sometimes Steve even knows it. Because here's the trick. The force doctrine always sounds compassionate at the beginning. We just want to help. Of course you do. Almost everyone does. The question isn't whether your goal is good. The question is what happens when somebody peacefully says no. But did you miss what's missing? Nobody ever starts with, what if we just convinced people? Nobody ever campaigns on persuasion. Imagine that commercial. Hi, I'm running for Congress. My plan is to make really compelling arguments. He'd lose by 30 points. So now let's talk about Steve. Poor Steve. Steve has become the unofficial mascot of this episode. Some of you probably think I don't like police officers. Not true. Steve is not the villain. Steve is the last domino. Think about it. Steve never writes the law. Steve didn't campaign on the law. As far as we know, Steve didn't vote for the law. Steve probably doesn't even like the law. Steve joined the police academy to investigate burglaries, something where a real law was broken. Instead, Steve gets handed a piece of paper that says, congratulations, this has now become your problem. Can you imagine that morning briefing? Okay, everybody, Johnson, robbery. Martinez, domestic disturbance. Steve, broccoli. Again. That's the joke. Because every law, whether it's about taxes, permits, licensing, parking, or broccoli, eventually lands on somebody named Steve. Not because Steve wants it to, but that's just how government works. Steve's worst week looks like this. Monday, illegal fireworks. Fair enough. Tuesday, violent assault. Absolutely, I was trained for this. Wednesday, a homeowner built a shed 3 inches too close to the property line. Steve just quietly stares into the middle distance. Thursday, a 12-year-old sold lemonade without a proper permit. Steve's therapist is making a fortune. Friday, Congress passes the National Broccoli Compliance Initiative. Steve quietly updates his resume. The point isn't that laws are stupid. The point is that every law eventually asks someone to enforce it. That's an enormous moral responsibility, which means maybe we should create fewer laws that put Steve in ridiculous situations. You know what's funny though? Nobody ever campaigns on maybe we should leave these people alone. Can you imagine that commercial? Hi, I'm Darren Hamilton. My plan is to mind my own business. I'm polling at almost 4%. That doesn't test well in focus groups. You know what does? Politicians saying, we're going to empower Americans. Empower, that's a beautiful word. Makes you think of inspiration, opportunity, possibility. And then you reach page 47 of the bill. Failure to comply. There it is, the Jedi mind trick. This isn't force. These aren't the mandates you're looking for. No, it's still a mandate. You just changed the font. Government has invented more euphemisms than HR department announcing layoffs. We're right-sizing. No, you're firing people. We're enhancing compliance. No, you're making Steve busier. And Steve doesn't really want to be busier. Not like this. And before anyone misunderstands, this isn't an anti-police argument. Like I said before, Steve is not the villain. Steve is the last domino. The human being standing at the end of a chain of decisions that he didn't design. So let's zoom out. Example 1, occupational licensing. Let's say I want to braid hair. Turns out I need a permit. You ask why. They answer safety. Okay, then what? Well, you can't legally operate. Then what? You'll be fined. Then what? Court. Then what? Steve. Example 2, food trucks. Imagine buying a smoker, perfecting your brisket recipe and deciding to start a food truck. Great. Then there's the permits, health inspections, licenses, paperwork. And if you ignore all of it, Steve. Example 3, the HOA. HOAs are basically governments where everyone thinks that they're George Washington because they once chaired the Christmas decorating committee. We all hate HOAs until Karen wants to paint her house purple, and then everybody becomes Steve. Example 4, parking tickets. Nobody argues that parking tickets shouldn't exist. That's exactly why they're effective. Everybody understands the sequence. You get a ticket. If you ignore it, more penalties, collections, court, boot, tow, arrest warrant, Steve. Example 5, the DMV. You ever notice that the DMV doesn't actually convince you to renew your license? They don't put out inspirational commercials. Renew because driving is awesome. No, eventually it's Steve. Different issues, same ending. Steve. So now here's where people get nervous and we'll need to answer the question that everybody's already typing into the comments. Okay, smart guy, are you saying the government should never use force? No, I'm saying something much more difficult than that. I'm saying we should finally decide when force is morally justified and be honest about the answer. And I want to be clear about something. Government force isn't inherently bad. It's sometimes necessary. Stopping violence, protecting people, defending rights. That matters. But once you accept that force is the tool, you have to be honest about when you're using it. Not hide it behind language, not bury it in paperwork, not pretend that it disappears. Because every law eventually asks the same thing. What happens when someone says no? That's the moment that everything changes. That's where the law stops feeling theoretical and starts involving a person. Steve. For instance, if someone kicks in my front door tonight, I don't want a social worker carrying a vision board. I want Steve. Actually, I want 6 Steves. Marine Steve, Canine Steve, SWAT Steve, coffee's been on since 5 a.m. Steve. Hell, bring everybody. Aggression deserves force. That's why civilization exists. That's why police exists. That's why self-defense exists. And that's why I carried a rifle in the Marines. Force does have a legitimate purpose. Stopping people who initiate force against others is just one example. But that's very different from initiating force against peaceful people because we prefer a particular policy outcome. That's the distinction, and it's an important one. So remember how this episode started? I told you that my autism diagnosis explained a lot. Here's one thing that it explained. I've spent my entire life asking questions everyone else seems strangely comfortable not asking. Not because I'm smarter, not because I'm braver, mostly because my brain won't let me stop halfway through the logic. If you tell me we need a law, I don't hear the campaign slogan, I hear the instruction manual. And somewhere around page 86, Steve shows up. So maybe before we pass the next law, before we create the next agency, before we write the next regulation, before we tell millions of strangers how they ought to live, maybe we ask one incredibly simple question. Not, is this a good idea? Lots of ideas are good. Ask this one instead. What happens if someone peacefully says no? Then what? Then what? Then what? Because somewhere at the end of every law, there's a human being, usually named Steve, who has to answer that question for all of us. And if we're going to ask Steve to do that, at least we can do is make sure that it was truly necessary. I'm Darren Hamilton, Marine veteran, adult diagnosed autistic, libertarian, professional overthinker, and apparently Steve's biggest advocate. Good night.